Boston, 1918. Something happened on that field. Something that would never happen again in the history of baseball. Nobody noticed at the time. Nobody understood what they were watching. Because understanding required knowing who that man was going to become. And in 1918, nobody knew yet. The pitcher walked to the mound. Threw. Dominated. The game progressed inning by inning the way games progress when one side is clearly in control, and the crowd settles into the specific comfort of watching something go the way it's supposed to go. Then the ninth inning arrived, and the same man, sweating, tired, arm aching from the work already done, walked to the plate. Different weapon, same man, and the ball he hit went to the stands. Who was on that field that day? And why was that moment the quietest turning point in the history of the sport? To understand what happened in 1918, you need to understand what Babe Ruth was at that point in his career. Not yet the Sultan of SWAT. Not yet the man who would redefine what a baseball player could be. He was 23 years old and one of the best left-handed pitchers in the American League. That was his identity in 1918. Pitcher. The Boston Red Sox had built their rotation around him. In 1916, he had won 23 games. In 1917, he had won 24. He had a curveball that broke in ways batters found genuinely difficult to manage, and a fastball that was not the fastest in the league, but that came with enough deception and movement to make the velocity irrelevant. He was a pitcher. That was the assignment. That was what Boston had paid for, and what Boston was getting. And then something began to complicate the assignment. Something that the Red Sox management noticed, and that the rest of baseball was beginning to notice, and that would, within 2 years, completely transform both Ruth's career and the sport itself. He could hit. Not just hit. Ruth could hit in ways that pitchers were not supposed to be able to hit. With power. With consistency. With the specific quality of contact that separates a man who is strong from a man who understands how to transfer that strength through a bat into a baseball at the precise moment when transfer is possible. He had hit 3 home runs in 1915, 11 in 1916, 2 in 1917, but in limited appearances. The numbers were not yet large, but the nature of the contact, the sound it made, the trajectory, the specific distance the ball traveled when Ruth connected fully, was different from what pitchers produced when they batted, different from what most position players produced, different in a way that was difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore once you had seen it. Manager Ed Barrow saw it, had been seeing it all spring, had been having the internal argument that managers have when a player shows them something that contradicts the established plan. The established plan was clear. Ruth was a pitcher. Pitchers pitched. You didn't take your best pitcher and put him in the outfield to protect his bat at the expense of his arm. The game didn't work that way. The roles were fixed. The roster was built around those fixed roles, and Ruth's role was the mound. But Barrow was also a man who understood that baseball's fixed roles existed because nobody had yet encountered a reason to challenge them. Ruth was that reason. He was both things simultaneously, in a way that the sports categories couldn't contain. A pitcher who could hit like a power hitter. A power hitter who could pitch like an ace. One player filling 2 needs that teams spent entire rosters trying to address. The question was not whether Ruth could do both. The question was whether the conventional wisdom about how baseball worked was more important than using what Ruth actually was. On that June afternoon in 1918, Barrow made his decision. Ruth would start as pitcher. He would take the mound and do what he had been doing for 3 seasons. He would keep the opposing team off the board with the tools that had made him one of the best pitchers in the American League. And if the situation demanded it later in the game, if Boston needed a bat at a critical moment, and Ruth's arm had done enough work that the risk of the additional effort was acceptable, Barrow would send him to the plate. Not as an experiment, not as a novelty, as a baseball decision made by a manager who trusted what his eyes had been telling him about one of his players all spring. Ruth was told the plan before the game. He received it the way Ruth received most things that were asked of him by the baseball operations he was part of. with agreement that carried the specific weight of a man who has been asked to do something he already believed he could do. The early innings were Ruth, as Boston knew him. Left arm working, the fastball locating, the curveball breaking with the late movement that batters had been struggling with for 3 years. He moved through the opposing lineup with the efficiency of a pitcher who has faced this lineup before and has remembered everything. Fly balls to the outfield, ground balls to the infield, the occasional strikeout that reminded the crowd why he was starting. The score stayed close because good pitching in a close game requires not just the pitcher, but the defense and the offense and all the contingencies of a baseball game that doesn't resolve cleanly. By the middle innings, the game was what close games are: tense, defined by small margins, decided by moments that arrive without announcement and are recognized only after they have passed. Then the 9th inning came. Boston needed something. The margin was what it was, and it needed protecting or extending, depending on which half of the inning was in question. Barrow looked at his options, looked at the situation, looked at Ruth, who had been throwing since the first inning and whose arm had done what arms do over 9 innings. Accumulated the specific fatigue that pitching at the major league level deposits in the shoulder and elbow and forearm in ways that don't show externally, but that the pitcher feels in every subsequent motion. And Barrow made the call. Ruth, plate, pinch hit. Ruth heard his name, set down whatever he was holding in the dugout, picked up a bat, walked to the plate with the unhurried quality that would later become one of his most recognizable characteristics. The pace of a man who has already decided what is going to happen and is simply moving through the space between the decision and the execution. Subscribe right now if you've ever watched someone do something nobody thought was possible. Hit like if you think Ruth should have been a pitcher or a hitter. And drop a comment. Which Ruth would you have wanted on your team, the pitcher or the hitter? Because what happened at the plate that day started something that baseball is still talking about. The pitcher on the mound looked at Ruth, processed the information. Ruth at the plate was a different calculation than Ruth on the mound. These were 2 separate problems. The pitcher had spent the game managing the first problem, how to score against Boston with Ruth pitching. Now he was facing the second problem, how to get Ruth out. And the second problem had a specific complication that the first had not. Ruth had been watching this pitcher all game. From the dugout, from the mound, during the innings when the pitcher came to bat. Watching the release point, the pitch selection in different counts, the tendencies that pitchers develop, without knowing they're developing them, that the best hitters catalog and file and retrieve when they need them. Ruth had been doing this his whole career. Even in the seasons when he was primarily a pitcher, he watched, he remembered, he knew things about this pitcher that the pitcher didn't know about himself. The pitch came. Ruth swung. The contact was the contact that Barrow had been watching all spring. The specific sound that carries differently than normal contact. The ball left the field of play before most of the people in the stands had processed that Ruth had swung. It went to the stands with the completeness of something that was never going to land in the field of play. Not a line drive to the warning track. Not a deep fly ball that required a second look. Gone. Clearly, undeniably, immediately gone. The crowd reacted with the specific noise of people who have just seen something that exceeded their expectations in a way they didn't fully anticipate. Ruth rounded the bases, crossed home plate, returned to the dugout. Barrow watched him come back, said nothing, filed what he had seen in the place where managers file things that confirm what they already believed. What happened next is the part that changed everything. Not immediately, not in a way that anyone announced or that the newspapers fully understood in the days that followed. But the game that afternoon had demonstrated something about Ruth that the pitching statistics and the conventional wisdom about how pitchers were used had been obscuring. He was not a pitcher who could also hit. He was something that didn't yet have a name in baseball's existing vocabulary. He was a player whose talent at the plate was so substantial, so far beyond what any pitcher produced, and beyond what most position players produced, that the question of which role he occupied was less important than the question of how to keep him in the lineup as much as possible, in any role that kept him there. The 1918 season was the last season Ruth was primarily a pitcher. He won 13 games. He also hit 11 home runs in 95 games. In 1919, Boston played him more often in the outfield. He hit 29 home runs, and the record that had seemed permanent began to look temporary. In 1920, he went to the Yankees and hit 54, then 59, then 60. The numbers that have defined him ever since came directly from the decision that Barrow began making in 1918, that Ruth's bat was more valuable than his arm, and that the sport would have to find a way to accommodate something it had never encountered before. Nobody in the stands that June afternoon in 1918 understood what they were watching. They saw a pitcher hit a home run. They registered it as unusual, as impressive, as the kind of thing you mentioned to people when you got home, because it was worth mentioning. They did not see the beginning of the most significant individual career in the history of professional baseball. They did not understand that the man rounding the bases had just demonstrated, in miniature, the thing that would redefine the sport over the following decade. They couldn't have understood that. Understanding required knowing what came next, required seeing 1920, and 1921, and 1927, and the World Series championships, and the records that stood for generations, required knowing that Babe Ruth was going to become Babe Ruth. In 1918, he was still becoming. And on that June afternoon in Boston, in a game that ended and was forgotten by most of the people who watched it, the becoming showed itself for a moment in the trajectory of a baseball hit by a tired pitcher who was also the best hitter anyone in that stadium had ever seen. They just didn't know it yet.